You can't believe a police statistic because they can be fudged so easily. You get told it's not a stats game, it's not this, it's not that, when I can clearly see that it is. Officers are leaving at a rate never seen before. It's projected by the Police Federation that up to 10,000 officers a year will be leaving soon. Officers are breaking. And I fear that there is a real public crisis going to happen in the near future when you're going to pick up the phone to call 999 for support and there's literally not going to be anyone available. So in order to backfill the people leaving, we are reducing the criteria of people coming in through the front door. If this was Microsoft or this was Starbucks, you have someone in the job who's maybe not the best qualified, you might just get a shit cup of coffee. When it comes to the police and dealing with cases and investigating cases, it can potentially be life or death.
This episode is sponsored by our friends at Hillsdale College. Right after this episode, go check out their incredible online courses, which are absolutely free at hillsdale.edu/trigger. Jay Darkmoore, welcome to TRIGGERnometry.
It's amazing to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's great to have you on. The subtitle of your book is The Secret Diary of a Police Officer, and the title is The Job's F***ed, which I think kind of says quite a lot. And, you know, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's these two narratives in our country at the moment. One is people feel increasingly unsafe, phone thefts feel like everyone I know has had their phone nicked. Yeah. I was actually in London in Mayfair a couple of days ago, and I literally watched a tourist have his bag snatched by a guy on one of those electric bikes. That's one thing. And then there's also people who are telling you the crime's never been lower, everything's great, everything's wonderful. What's your take?
You can't believe a police statistic because they can be fudged so easily. So what happens is the senior leadership team, they will have an agenda, so to speak. And what they will do is they will look at a certain, I don't know, take domestic violence, for example, in particular when it comes to violence against women and girls. That's the biggest load of, pardon my phrase, that's the biggest load of shit you can possibly quantify because of the way that it's dealt with. Now, I get a lot of crap when I do speak about the police, when I speak about the great work, what they do, because we only see the bad work, what happens. We see that crime's not being solved. We see that, like you said, people right in front of you, crime's happening there and there. We hear of burglaries not going detected. There's a whole thing about grooming gangs not being investigated. All that stuff hits the media because people want to slate the police because they're easy targets. And of course, the actions, what the police do or don't do directly affects people's lives. So I can completely understand where that vitriol towards the police officers coming from. But because I've been on the other side of it and I'm in regular contact with other officers, I get to see all the really hard work what officers do, which never makes the headlines. And unfortunately, because of what's happening right now, in particular, like I mentioned before about senior leadership teams and essentially having their own career prospects and own agendas at the forefront of the mind, not public safety, not what's best for the public, but what looks best for them on paper. We're seeing so many officers now not able to catch the criminals who are stealing people's phones, not able to investigate the burglars, not able to investigate the things what people want them to investigate, simply because officers are breaking. And I fear that there is a real public crisis going to happen in the near future when you're going to pick up the phone to call 999 for support and there's literally not going to be anyone available because so many police officers have left. There is a real mental health crisis in the police. There's a real disparity between, like we said, what people want to be investigated and what is actually investigated and how that looks when it's presented as a statistic. There's a huge problem with our public service in relation to the police and it's only getting worse. And the unfortunate thing is, police officers on the ground, they either can't speak out because they bring the force into disrepute, so they can't speak out publicly about what's happening on their end. And then what happens is when they fill in these morale and pay surveys, they just get ignored. So they've got every avenue inside their job, which they're supposed to have to say, we're unhappy because of this, we're being told to investigate this, I feel that my morality is being stripped away because I'm being made to do something I don't agree with for the sake of helping somebody further up their career ladder. Meanwhile, we're just getting from the public because we're being told we're not good enough. Our pay has been stripped back real terms by about 21% since 2010, I believe it is. Then there's everything in the media to again further kick officers. Then the politicians and the government are taking everything away from them. Mental health welfare is not there. Post-traumatic stress disorder, I believe the Police Federation said that about 35% of frontline officers would qualify for PTSD, if not complex PTSD. Officers are screaming that we're drowning, that we're really, really struggling, and the people who were there to protect them don't give a shit.
Well, you know, as just a member of the public in this particular instance, when I'm talking about the way people feel about crime, I've never met anyone who thinks police officers are to blame for this, actually. And certainly, you know, of course, there's going to be people who are not doing their job, like in any job. But broadly speaking, I have a tremendous amount of admiration and respect and gratitude to the police, because those are the people you're going to call when things are going on that you don't want going on. But I also think it's certainly from an experience perspective for a lot of people, it's become undeniable that our day-to-day quality of life when it comes to safety, particularly in the big cities, is just not going in the right direction. And I don't think we can deny that either, right? So you're hinting at that's a lot to do with senior leadership. It's to do with the way it's being funded, of course, as well. What are the key reasons why you've got this problem where you've got very decent, well-intentioned police officers doing their job to the best of their ability, and yet all of these other problems are getting worse?
Well, it's really nice to hear what you said there, in that, you know, you respect the police, and a lot of people who you interact with also understand the hard work that officers, what they have to do, and the impossibly difficult job what officers have to do. Because it's easy for, if I was in the police, to look on the internet and look at the media and go, well, everyone just thinks we're a piece of shit.
Is that really people feel that way? Because let's just say this, and one of the things as well on that is we have this conversation with Francis all the time. Whenever there's been, do you remember that Chris Cabba shooting?
Yes.
This is a guy who tried to ram police officers in a stolen vehicle, I think, whilst under suspicion of committing a firearms offence, and the police shot him as he was trying to ram them. And there was these dickheads in the media going, oh, I can't believe it. We're like, no, that's exactly what's supposed to happen. The same with the Manchester airport thing. Like, when I saw that tiny clip, I was like, there's no way this is the entirety of what's happened here. An armed police officer is not going to be kicking someone in the head for no reason. Like, all of this other stuff. So I think actually there's quite a lot of people like us who go, fair enough, like, and what a terribly difficult job it is. So if police officers are watching this, they should know the majority of the public have your back, totally.
And now that's, like I said, that's amazing to hear, and it's quite refreshing as well, because all you have to do is look on Instagram or TikTok or Reels, and you just see Alder Tyrone's police officer, and you see it's a clipped footage of an officer who has had a phone shoved in the face, been asked to recite every single law, every single piece of legislation possible, and then equally being told that you're not good enough and everything else. And people going, well, what about this? What about that? And it's like, listen, I work in a local station. I'm on my 5th shift. I've had my last 2 rest days cancelled. I'm just trying to stay afloat. But sorry, what was the second part to that?
So what I was getting at is, if we accept what the three of us, I'm sure, agree on, which is the overwhelming majority of police officers doing their very best in difficult circumstances, they're good people, well-intentioned, they've got into the job for the right reasons. How is it then possible, and you've alluded to some areas, but perhaps you can go deeper, that in terms of actual public safety, I put it to you, we're not moving in the right direction, right? So how are these two things happening at once?
I think definitely the emphasis on the wrong kind of crimes is being pushed forward. So police forces are measured on their performance via stats, tick boxes, how many arrests they can get, how many detections they can get. In my opinion, I feel like police forces, rather than deal with the complex issue of knife crime, dealing with the more resource-heavy incidents, such as your burglaries. The things what people generally talk about is they're going for a lot of the low-hanging fruit, such as somebody's posted this online, that's offended somebody. The thing of a hate crime is that the victim doesn't have to perceive it to be a hate crime. As long as somebody in the evidential chain believes it's a hate crime, it then is classified as a hate crime. Police want to stamp out hate. You know, it looks good. We're tackling hate crime. And of course, if you knock on somebody's door and you arrest them for a hate crime, or sometimes what happens is the police will even arrest somebody. They'll go, okay, you've been suspected of something, sign that. It means you don't need to go to court, but it basically means that you're accepting culpability for what you've done. You might go on an awareness course, or it's called restorative justice. You might have to write a letter of apology or something. The officer going to that incident doesn't want to do that because they would rather be dealing with other more serious things. The senior leaders are going, yeah, but if we get this tick in the box, it makes us look better. It means that, we're getting more detections. So in my opinion, they're going for the low-hanging fruit. Now, why have we gotten into this position where people perceive that the police force is failing? And that comes down to the directors from the officers at the top pushing the orders down. But when we talk about the officers on the ground, it comes down to, I believe, officer retention. Officers are extremely unhappy in their work they're doing because of reasons what we've already said. Therefore, officers are leaving at a rate never seen before. It's projected by the Police Federation that up to 10,000 officers a year will be leaving soon. 10,000
out of a total of?
I think there's 140,000 officers in the UK. Someone will probably fact check me on that. But 10,000 of any workforce leaving in mass droves is seriously alarming. And this goes back to what I said before about you're going to one day pick up the phone, there's literally going to be no one there. So in order to backfill the people leaving, we are reducing the criteria of people coming in through the front door, which means that we are hiring the people who we wouldn't have otherwise hired in order to backfill that. I had a senior leader, quite a senior rank, actually message me and say to address this. And they said, it's cheaper to get someone new in rather than to pay for experience because of the overall cost of having an officer. But that reduces a mass in service to the public. It reduces the quality of the officer to the public. And the people that are coming in, because they're inexperienced, because, it may be their dream job, they don't want to upset their senior leadership team. So if their senior leadership team goes, go and arrest that guy for posting something on X, or you've had this domestic incident, this person needs to come in regardless of what you're seeing in front of you, regardless of whether it's proportionate and everything else, they're going to say yeah, because they don't want to upset the leadership team. They don't have the experience to know what is necessary. They don't have the experience to know what is justified, what is necessary. They get 16 weeks in a classroom, which is death by PowerPoint. Then once they are released onto the front line, they then get 10 weeks with somebody else. They then get 10 weeks in company with somebody who probably doesn't have much more experience than them. I believe 35% of frontline officers have less than 5 years service. I think under 50% have less than 10. And over 50% mark, officers have either moved to back office roles, have become more specialised, have moved off front line, have started going up the promotion ladder. So the majority of police officers out there now are quite inexperienced, and they're being conditioned to, if you don't follow this order, if you don't arrest at this incident, if you don't do as you're told, you're going to be reprimanded for it. And I've been told that there's officers now who are actually colour graded, green, amber and red, based on how many lockups they get, how many stop searches they get, how many traffic tickets, or how many intelligence reports they get. So if you've got a brand new officer who's already sinking in their workload, and then they're being told they've not been trained properly because the officer who's training them doesn't have much more experience than them, you've then got senior leadership team contacting them and saying, you're low on your arrests this month, you need to arrest this person or you're going to be in the shit. Naturally, they're going to go for the more easier arrests than the more resource-heavy ones, even though that the public want those more resource-heavy things to be investigated. That's not what gets the easy tick boxes, and that's not what makes the police force look the best.
And it's so interesting that you say that, because in your book, you talk about going to domestic violence incidents, and there are some times where it's been reported as a domestic violence, but it actually isn't. It's just, as what happens with a lot of relationships, things get heated, people are shouting and screaming, but there's no domestic violence. Yet the police officers are told that they have to arrest someone. And then all these kind of arrests happen, and then people lose faith in the police.
Yeah. So a lot of the time, what's happening is, while the officers are actually on their way to that incident, they have their senior officer radioing them going, they've said this on the call, or we're low on arrests, domestic arrests this month, you better make sure someone's coming away in handcuffs. So even before the officers got into this situation, has spoken to the parties, and often these officers are single crewed as well, which is a massive issue when it comes to safety. And not just safety, but being able to investigate it effectively, because generally at a domestic incident, there's two people. You know, there's a victim and offender. So officers are going, they're being pressured and told what to do. I had an officer speak to me and say, they went to an incident which involved two 16-year-old brothers. One of them was quite heavily autistic or had some form of learning difficulty. Mm-hmm. They were then instructed to get the children, get one of the children who was considered the aggressor to sign a pocket notebook entry to say that they're very sorry for hitting a brother or something like that. Mm. Now, I don't agree that should be happening. Siblings fight, okay? Of course, things can get out of hand and it can move on to what is considered criminal. But that means now that child, when they go for a job in the future, if they do a check in the local police system, if it's say an enhanced DBS check, they'll show up that they've had not a conviction, but the police have been involved for some kind of domestic violence incident. Now, of course, that can have ramifications further on down the line. And my point is with that is, this isn't what the officer wants to do. This is what somebody who's not there is instructing them to do. So what does this do to the officers? It reduces their morale because they feel that what they're doing isn't right. It reduces their autonomy because they feel that they don't have a choice in what they're doing. It completely strips away all the training what the officers get because it just follows a diagram. If this is disclosed, this is the action you take. Where's the nuance gone? Where's your national decision making? Where's the safeguarding? Where's your risk assessment? Where's the alternative outcome outside of an arrest? Like you mentioned, purely because it's got that domestic violence label on it, people are being arrested and then they're being taken to custody. And then the custody sergeants are under massive amounts of pressure as well. The custody sergeants are basically being told, if you refuse a domestic arrest, you're going to be in the as well. So there's all sorts of breaches when it comes to necessity, when it comes to the law, what the officers have to follow. And I'm all for taking positive action at a domestic incident. I've been a victim of domestic violence myself. I know plenty of people that have been victims of domestic violence. I've dealt with serious, severe cases of domestic violence. The problem is, if you want to look at the thing of violence against women, for example, that is obviously a very serious problem which needs to be solved. But what they're doing is they're trying to crack a walnut with a sledgehammer. They're taking an all-encompassing approach to any kind of domestic incident. They've only got this one thing, which is arrest. And even though it says positive action can mean a myriad of things. It can mean separate the parties. It can mean, is there any other potential outcome we can do to support this family who are clearly in crisis? But they're only going for the one option because that's the one what the bosses want. They want those arrest stats because it makes the force look better. Then when someone's arrested, a lot of the time, even if there was even if there wasn't really that necessity there, the senior officers are going, well, interview them anyway, because if they incriminate themselves on interview, that then justifies the arrest retroactively, which is completely wrong. That shouldn't happen. So I can see why certainly public confidence is going down in the police, because we're taking the autonomy away from the police officers that have been trained to enact their powers in the correct way. And the police force are now being seen as unreasonable, punitive, and in a sense quite mindless, if you get me, because they're not being told to think for themselves. If anything, if you do think for yourselves, you're punished as a result. And that is unfortunately what is then, I believe, leading to this mass exodus in the police, because officers join to do a particular job and to do it for the right reasons, and they're not allowed to do that by the very people who are meant to be there to protect and support them.
Something we've learned doing this show is that people's thoughts about a given issue often depend on where they get their news. That's why we use ground news to see how the same story is reported across the political spectrum.
For example, take the story about Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson signing an executive order creating so-called ICE-free zones. Follow along at ground.news/triggernometry Using Ground News, straight away we can quickly see that the story is being covered by sources across the board, but with more coverage from outlets on the right. Scrolling down the page, Ground News allows us to easily compare the headlines. We can see the Chicago Sun-Times, which is on the left, focused on the city's decision to declare municipal buildings ice-free. Meanwhile, The Hill, a centrist newspaper, simply stated that Chicago's mayor signs ice-free zone executive order. But the New York Post, on the right, went with White House blasts sick Chicago mayor for aiding illegal immigrant killers. Same news story, completely different takes. Ground News compiles these divergent perspectives in one place.
Another feature we use heavily at TRIGGERnometry is the blind spot feed, which highlights where coverage is lopsided, lets you compare bias across the political spectrum, and shows what's being emphasized or ignored. If you care about getting to the truth by seeing things from all angles, Ground News is essential. Go to ground.news/TRIGGERnometry and get 40% off their Unlimited Vantage plan. That's the plan we use. That link again is ground.news/TRIGGERnometry.
And it's also as well, I mean, just imagine you have a row with your missus, things get a bit heated, words are said. Well, you know, like I said, it happens to a lot of people at certain points in their marriage. Just imagine you get arrested by the police. All of a sudden, your neighbours see you in cuffs being led out of your house. You then get checked into custody. You get put in a cell. You then get questioned by the police. I mean, that must be incredibly distressing.
Yeah, I mean, it's happened to me. It happened to me. I was in a domestic violent relationship, and this is really when all this kind of opened my eyes to everything what was happening. Allegation made against me. I was arrested. I was then taken to custody, spending, I mean, them cells are not nice, and the food's even worse. So you're spending 12 hours in a cell, just completely ruminating, thinking, am I going to lose my job? For whatever reason, we're going to get charged. Social services now going to be involved with my child. Everyone's going to think I'm a domestic abuser and everything else. So, and then you actually get interviewed and you're thinking, I'm being interviewed by the police here over something which I've not done anything wrong. It's an allegation has been made. And this happened so many times when I was in the service, sitting opposite people, where I'm sitting there going, you're an arrest for a statistic. And I know that this is going to be no further action because obviously I've done enough of the cases to know. And I'm thinking, you should have never been here. There was one case what we dealt with where a male contacted the police to say that 8 months ago, his ex-partner had pushed him into a wall, causing him a cut to his face. These two people lived about 300 miles apart. One lived down south, one lived at the top end of the country. And I took a statement of the male over the phone, and I went on to manual leave after that, and I wrote all over the log. I wrote all over it, do not arrest, no necessity to arrest, case is 8 months old, we've basically got no evidence other than what he said. No pictures or nothing, no domestic history, justified it to the nines. I then came in a week later, the lady had been arrested. I think she spent, I don't know, 12 hours, 18 hours in custody. And by the end of it, I think she had a mental breakdown. She got so stressful being arrested. Thankfully, she had a solicitor, so the solicitor banged the drum to say, this is completely unlawful, release her immediately. And then she was. And then funny enough, the male then was able to use that arrest because he knew what the domestic violence policy was in our force, was able then to use that as ammunition in family court when it came to arguments over his daughter. And this is another thing which, when we have this one-size approach of cracking a nut with a sledgehammer, is we are actually not only failing victims of serious abuse because we don't have the resources to deal with the genuine cases because we're trying to deal with everything, is we are then allowing perpetrators, coercive controlled domestic abusers, to use the system as a third-party proxy of abuse. So there was a case what I had sight of where a lady left a relationship which was volatile. She never wanted to make a formal complaint against her abuser because of the element of fear and control and everything else. And because she left that relationship, the male contacted the police to get her arrested so that she'd be placed on bail so that she couldn't go near the house or the children. So via this lock up and ask questions later mentality the police now have as a derivative and direction from the senior leadership team, we're actually harming women and girls and not protecting them properly. So, and an arrest, like you mentioned, Francis, getting arrested it can be a serious traumatic incident for somebody. If you are in and out of custody all the time, it's just another day. I once locked up a lad and he said, "Oh, I can't be arsed getting locked up," but okay. So sorry, as if you're going to get some fucking milk from the shop, but it can't be arsed. But to your everyday person who's maybe never had any interaction with the police, it's a serious, impactful event. And not only that, the best case scenario is that you are arrested and then, there's no further action at custody. You can just go home. But you still have a PNC record. You've still been arrested. It'll still show up that you've been arrested for domestic violence or whatever. So that can affect your job opportunities later on. But even if then you are bailed because the supervisor doesn't want to make that decision themselves, they'd rather pass it on to the Crown Prosecution Service in order to make the decision later down the line, what's happening then is this person maybe can't go home for 3 months because they're on bail. Now, what if it's a case of maybe they're a new family, maybe they've got a young child who isn't sleeping properly, maybe the mother has postnatal depression, maybe the father is working 2 jobs to try and keep a roof over the head, seeing that, the mum's now out of work. Maybe things just get to a boiling point and they have a serious, a blowout and an argument, and a third party rings the police. A neighbour says, next door arguing. Police then turn up under this guise of lock up first, ask questions later because I've got my supervisor breathing down my neck. That male might then be alienated from his child for probably minimum of 3 months, because that case will then be passed to another department, which are then massively overworked, and then they have to build the file and send it to CPS. CPS then have 28 days to respond, and if there's anything wrong, it gets sent back. That's another 28 days, bail extensions and everything else. That can cause serious problems for that family. And I've been told by someone who works in the criminal justice department in some capacity that they know people who have actually ended their lives due to being on bail for too long. I think they told me 5 or 6 so far at the time of writing that. But the sinister part of that is, if you were on bail for assault, for example, and then for whatever reason you were no longer living, the police get the tick in the box as a detection. It goes down as a positive outcome. So even though it's never been proved, it's actually a good thing for the police if you die. That's a bit fucked up to me.
I mean, that is awful. So there are people who have lost their lives because of being arrested, and that is seen as a positive outcome. I mean, it's completely heartbreaking. The stories that you tell in the book, there's so many. There was the story about, the woman who was a victim of horrendous domestic violence. The police came. She had a marijuana joint half smoked in an ashtray, and the police arrested her for it.
Yeah, so they didn't arrest her. What they did was they're taking a statement off her. She'd been assaulted. I don't remember exactly what happened, but she'd been a victim of domestic abuse. She calls the police. Police turn up. They're like, okay, everything's fine. Meanwhile, she's got half a joint in an ashtray. The police go, fucking hell, we can get another stat here. They then stop taking the statement. They then say, you've got that there. Sign that to say that you're going to drug awareness course. Otherwise, you might get locked up for possession of cannabis. The lady then signs it. And needless to say, she doesn't want to make a statement anymore. So again, officers, because they're being forced and being pushed to get as many detections and many statistics as possible, they're now seeing people as a tick in the box. That was a case of domestic assault, which has high rates of homicide when you look at the statistics. Potentially that's the first time that lady called the police for help. Potentially that's the first time she'd been willing enough to actually open up and say, you know what, yeah, I need your help. And the officers in that instance, rather than kind of maybe ignore it or just go, you can't have that, I'm taking it off you, and that's done, would rather go, oh great, we can get 2 for 1 here. And then they'd wonder why she then didn't want to pursue a complaint when she sees the police as not there to support her, but as punitive.
And why are senior police officers under so much pressure to tick these boxes and fulfill these stats? Is it political pressure?
I'm not entirely sure where the whole pressure comes from. But all I can assume it's the chief constable wants this to happen. So then everyone under the chief constable go, okay, well, we need to keep the boss happy. So then we will enforce what they want, and we will create initiatives, directive, etc., to then enforce that. And then, of course, that trickles down, the great phrase, rolls downwards. That then impacts the officers on the ground, which ultimately impacts the public.
No, that makes total sense. I guess I'm asking why the chief constable would have that agenda. And coming back to where we started the conversation, we've got to a point where, the authorities are basically, it feels like to me at least, are basically gaslighting the public about what's happening. So they're saying, violent crime is down and, this is down. And you go, it's just objectively not true. And I think if you are in politics trying to push these numbers onto the police, it's not actually going to help, because ultimately the public are going to go, well, I don't feel safer, so what does it matter what the stats say? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. So gaslighting the public, I can imagine that, it certainly feels that way. Certainly for me, looking now as an outsider, it certainly feels that way. But even when I was in the police, the senior leadership will gaslight their own staff. The things what are happening right in front of you, they will say are not happening.
Like what?
So they'll be told, we do not arrest at every domestic violence incident. Meanwhile, anecdotally, we can see that is what's happening. The officers going to the incidents are being told to arrest. We're being told that the force isn't statistic driven. Meanwhile, what will happen is, so for example, say if you have a case and there's one incident, due to national crime recording standards, every snippet of any possible incident which occurs in that one will then generate a new crime. So let me paint a picture of that. So Barry the bastard steals something from the shop. You got shoplifting, you got theft. On his way home, calls his neighbour a cunt. Okay, so then that's public order. Oh, it's not the first time he's done it either, so now it's harassment. On his way back, he, kicks someone's car, caused a bit of a dent. That's now criminal damage. And then he gets home and he tweets something nasty. Okay, so then you got malicious communications as well. So then you got 6 crimes there. Barry the bastard might be actually only prosecuted for one of those, which has strong enough evidence. But due to the way stats are detected, out of 6 crimes, even if one's detected, all 6 are classed as detected. One's classed as charged as is, as in that's what we say. The other ones are just classed as a positive outcome. And it was a colleague, an ex-colleague of mine, who basically told me this. And then, of course, it made sense. So that's why the crime so many different things, why you have to list them so much when you're taking the case further. But the police will deny that this is happening. And also what was also happening was, when the new financial year was coming in, officers who had people on bail and victims who were waiting for an outcome to their case were being told, don't close those crimes yet, wait a few weeks or a couple of months until, the new financial year, because that will make our stats look better for less NFAs. So if I had 20 cases in my workload and I knew 10 of them were going nowhere, that's 10 victims sitting at home wondering what's happening. That's potentially 10 people on bail wondering when their bail's up. I'd be told, yeah, well, ignore them for now. You have to keep updating the logs every single time you come in. You then can't close those because it makes the force look worse if they're closed before this date, because that's when the clock resets. And you get told it's not a stats game. It's not this, it's not that, when I can clearly see that it is. So in regards to gaslighting the public, I can imagine that it's happening because the police gaslight their own staff.
There's something powerful about tracing our civilization back to its roots. Hillsdale's free online course, Western Heritage from the Book of Genesis to John Locke, does exactly that. Visit hillsdale.edu/trigger to get instant access to the whole thing.
Over 11 lessons and 11 hours of lectures, you'll explore how Western civilization emerged from 2 ancient pillars, Jerusalem and Athens. You'll delve into the Hebrews, the Golden Age of Greece, the Roman Republic, early Christianity, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Scientific Revolution. You'll see how each era contributed to the ideas of liberty, faith, and reason that ultimately culminated in the American founding. The course comes with free readings and quizzes, so you're not just watching videos, you're learning deeply. If you've ever wanted to understand how our civilization developed from Genesis all the way to Locke, this is the perfect starting point.
Get instant access to the entire course at hillsdale.edu/trigger. That's hillsdale.edu/trigger.
And based on what you're saying, correct me if this is wrong, but your example about Barry the Bastard, what it sounds like is the police are incentivized to arrest people irrespective of whether that particular crime is then charged and prosecuted.
Oh yeah, 100%. So
the police are incentivized to arrest people even if they know that it's not going to go anywhere.
yeah, so because it depends on what that particular force might be pushing. So if it's just arrests, then they'll arrest anyone for pretty much fucking anything. They'll justify it later. An example of this was, like you said, two people had an argument at home. One person was arrested. There wasn't really a crime there, no necessity. The inspector at the custody suite later on justified the arrest based on what they felt the victim would have felt at the time, even though they were nowhere near it. That then justifies the arrest. So if a police force is pushing to say, we want to say that our arrests have gone up by 25%, well, yeah, of course, then handcuffs are going to go on much easier. Regardless of the outcome, detections, sometimes, like I said, it depends on where the focus is for the police force at that time. If it's on detections, you'll find more sensible arrests because the officers won't want to arrest people if they don't feel that there's the evidence for the prosecution later. If it's the other way around, where we just focus on arrests, well, then handcuffs are going to go on much easier with less justification because we're not really measuring what happens later on down the line. So it depends where the focus is, if you get me.
And one of the things that you talk about in the book, which was really interesting, is the impact of DEI on the police force. And obviously you make it very clear that there's been brilliant officers who are from a Black Asian background. In fact, we've interviewed one of them on this show. But you also said that poses a very real problem for all the police forces up and down the country.
Yeah, so I've worked with some fantastic gay officers, black officers, I've no issues whatsoever. As long as you can do the job and you do it properly, then by all means. My issue is when people aren't being hired because of an immutable characteristic and other people are being hired instead of them who might not necessarily be better qualified. Now, when it comes to if this was Microsoft or this was Starbucks, you have someone in the job who's maybe not the best qualified, you might just get a cup of coffee. When it comes to the police and dealing with cases and investigating cases, it can potentially be life or death for some people. So yeah, I have a real big problem with it. And like I said, the reason why I would say that the quality of officers may be perceived now as not being as good as it could be is because we're struggling so much to keep officers on the back end. So we're just trying to backfill. Also, what I think needs to go is a university degree. You do not need a university degree to be a police officer, because not only is it not required. I never did the policing degree. I did 10 years, and I would like to say I was quite good at my job. As well as other officers I worked with, never did the university degree, very, very good. The stress what I've seen colleagues be under, because not only have they got 30, 40 crimes in their workload, which is 30, 40 victims potentially, to manage, as well as deal with the everyday thing of shift work, investigations, response, everything else. Not only do they have all that to manage, they then got a university degree to manage as well. And it also puts additional stress on the team because Jack, who is on the university degree, might then have 6 weeks at university doing his policing degree, which means that the rest of the team then have to do Jack's workload. Also, just talking about the quality of the officers coming in, I've heard stories that we're now hiring officers who need emotional support snails. I've heard of officers who they can't pass the fitness test. So the fitness test is 5.4 on the bleep test, which I think is awful anyway for a police officer. Billy the burglar is not going to run 10 meters, stop, and then run under the 10 meters. And in order to support people who fail that, what they've then done is so that's your initial one. They've then reduced the recurring yearly fitness test down to, I think, 3.8. So it's even slower. been told of officers now who come in, they can't even hit 1.6, 1.7 on the bleep test, but they're still being allowed to come in. If I'm pressing my red button for assistance and I'm half a mile up a dirt track, I don't want someone who can't hit 1.6 on the bleep test. I want the person who can get there as quick as possible. And if you're grabbing hold of someone and you're struggling with someone, it's very physically taxing. It's difficult. So I think the bleep test needs to be eradicated. I think the fitness test needs to be made more job applicable. But just focusing back on what you mentioned initially about the DEI is we're actively stopping officers who would be a better suit for the job in favour of other demographics of people.
Because they're trying to make the police more quote-unquote representative.
Yeah, they're trying to make the police, obviously, be more representative of the general public, which I completely understand that is necessary, but I don't think it's necessary at the quality of the officers which then are there to support said public. So there was an initiative in my old force where they wanted to get more females into firearms. Okay, that's fine. But that means that if I'm a male who would be really, really well suited to firearms, I'm not going to be able to get that job because they're looking at just females.
And what's the rationale for getting more female officers into firearms?
I think
roles?
it's just more representation in that role, to be more representative of the general public.
Do you really need firearms officers? Like, I get that, if someone pops around to check your house after it's been burgled, it might actually be really nice to have a lady who's going to be a little bit more sensitive on average and all of these other things. But in a firearms role, is that really, like, is that the area where you really want to push those? Do you see what I'm saying? Am I being unfair?
No, I understand what you're saying. The Manchester terror attack that recently happened outside the synagogue, I could not give a shit whether that's male, female, or whoever holding that gun and stopping that terrorist.
Right.
The main thing is the terrorist got stopped.
Yeah.
I think what we're doing is we're focusing on the wrong thing of having, I don't know, what sex somebody is or what ethnicity somebody is in a certain specialist role, rather than the capability of the people who are actually hiring into that role.
No, as you well know, I totally agree with you about this. I guess the point I'm making is a little bit more specific than that, which is, if we accept the argument that a police force ought to be as close to representative of the society that it's policing as possible without, putting people in positions that are not qualified, even if we accept that, I do think there are some very particular niche roles where performance is really the only criterion. And I would imagine that armed police officers in this country, of whom there are not that many, whose job it is to respond to very high-risk events, that's an area where you really would put performance above everything else. And it just strikes me as very odd that there would be that push. You know what I mean? To me, that looks like a loss of perspective.
Yeah, I completely agree. But it depends on, I don't know, maybe the political ideology of the senior leadership team at the time, who then want to look at, okay, well, we need to improve our diversity quota. Where we're potentially struggling, well, firearms is predominantly male, so maybe let's open it up to females, and then let's get those officers in there at the cost of potentially not having the right person in that job. And like we said, I don't care what sex somebody is, if they take down a terrorist or attend a critical incident with a firearm, as long as they get the job done.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned political ideology or ideology in general of the people in charge. We've heard a lot on our show about the College of Policing, particularly in relation to LGBTQ, the trans stuff.
You forgot the IA+.
Oh, that was not an accident. All of that stuff. How much of the politicization is there going on within the police in terms of, these fairly controversial ideas being considered sort of mainstream and in fact being taught to police officers as a must?
So from my experience, we would see officers encouraged to put their pronouns in their bio, for example. It's a bio email. Yeah. Spend so much time on Instagram, my apologies. It was never particularly enforced in that if you didn't want to do it, there was never anyone breathing down your neck. They would hold days for neurodiversity, they would hold days for intersectionality issues, etc. But there's two faults to this. So I remember I spoke to somebody from the College of Policing because I wanted to understand that, is this coming from them? And they said the College of Policing is more of a toothless tiger, in the sense of they can request that certain things be pushed forward. They can write the guidelines, but it's up to the chief constable of the force whether they actually want to implement it or not. So the government directs what they want down to the College of Policing to be pushed into policing. It's down to the people who are in control of the police force as to whether that's implemented or not. So whereas some police forces might maybe not necessarily take part in Pride events, for example, other police forces might. And I think that's less College of Policing instruction and more down to the leadership team who want to maybe appear more inclusive or diverse to their population and to their officers.
I think that's an interesting perspective, but I wonder whether in an environment in which everyone's encouraged to be, inclusive and diverse and whatever, if you're a chief constable who maybe has aspirations of some kind of promotion or, a job elsewhere or something, whether you really do feel that it's entirely your decision whether you take these College of Policing guidelines and implement them, or maybe it's just easier to go along with this stuff as it has been in every other profession, really. If you're working in corporate Britain, it was so much easier to just go, oh, fine, whatever, we'll do this, we'll do that, we'll do a diversity seminar, we'll do some kind of sensitivity training. I wonder if those chief constables really are as independent as you're saying, I guess.
Well, I mean, the chief constable is held to account by the police chief and crime commissioner, and they are a politically elected party. So we've got a police force which is meant to be independent of politics, police without fear or favour, with almost the PCC potentially instructing, I'll never climb that high, I'm not entirely sure, potentially instructing the chief constables as to, okay, well, we want more of a push on this, we want this to go down the chain of command. With you saying about the diversity and everything else, I had an experience of it which I found quite interesting. So just going back to what I was talking about, domestic violence, I went on specific training courses on how to, be quite accredited at that. Half of it was to do with the domestic violence. The other half was completely about intersectionality. It was completely to do with ask people the pronouns when you speak to them. It was completely to do with you don't know what kind of issues somebody may face if they're in a heterosexual relationship or a gay relationship or a lesbian relationship. You don't know the cultural differences. So such a specialist course, which we went on, was actually only half about what we've signed up for. And the other half was all to do with intersectionality, cultural differences, pronouns, everything else. And I just found it very bizarre that why we're being taught this for as long as we were, when the main focus should be on what we wanted to do in the first place.
And what were some of the cultural sensitivity ones? Because that sounds like that could be super useful or super not useful. And
it was a while back. I'm trying to remember. It was a lot to do with, say, like countries where the male is generally the one in charge of the household. So say such as African countries, some of your Muslim countries. There was that sort of thing, and it was.
And then what's that? Having that information, how is that supposed to shape your behaviour as a police officer?
I'm not entirely sure. When it comes in relation to that course.
Because I imagine if you go into a domestic violence incident, whether the male is normally in charge is kind of somewhat irrelevant.
Yeah, you would look at what is in front of you.
Right.
You would assess the situation and speak to the parties independently.
Yeah.
And assess what's going on.
Yeah.
The cultural sensitivity part can maybe looked at maybe a little bit later when it comes to, okay, well, why are they not making a statement? Or do we have to look at potentially this could be more severe, such as honour-based? But as a response officer, you would generally deal with the incident there and then, and you would have more specialist units which would look into that more expertly. You would potentially say, I believe this could be honour-based, or this is a patriarchal household where it's not equal, and then speak to the correct units. But to have half a day specialist on that, I just thought it was quite excessive. And when it comes to, like you said, about the political inference from government, about DEI and everything else, I think they are quite closely connected.
Here's the truth. Most of us have no idea where our money actually goes. It's not because we're reckless, it's because modern life spreads our finances across 10 different places. That's why I've started using Monarch. It's a beautifully simple personal finance tool that lets you link all your accounts, savings, investments, mortgages, everything into one clear visual dashboard. Once I set it up, it was like turning the lights on. I could see what was earning, what was sitting idle, and where I could save more. And because my wife and I share the same view, we're finally working towards our goals together instead of guessing in the dark. No spreadsheets, no manual updates, just clarity.
It's why Forbes named Monarch the best app for couples, and why so many people are switching from messy spreadsheets to something that actually works. Feel organized and confident in your finances with Monarch, an all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean interface on your laptop or your phone. Don't let financial opportunities slip through the cracks. Use code TRIGGER at monarch.com in your browser for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarch.com with code TRIGGER. And one of the things, Jay, that you talk about a lot is the fact that the police is expected to do things which they shouldn't actually be doing. And one of the examples you use is the mental health call out. Like somebody's having a type of episode or a breakdown, the police are going to get there far quicker normally than an ambulance. Yeah. So it's your job, even though that's not really what you signed up for.
Police officers deal with so many mental health calls. Like I would say if I went to 10 incidents in a day, at least half would be mental health related.
What do you mean? Let's explore that. What do you mean by mental health related?
Generally, it's people who they're feeling suicidal. So the police will go. Because the ambulance might say, oh, they've said they've got a knife, they're going to stab themselves. Well, then they have a weapon. So then the ambulance won't go unless the police go first. By the time the police have got there and they're dealing with that person, that ambulance crew has probably been taken off to somewhere else. So then the police then have to talk to them. They have to try and convince them to go to the hospital for a mental health assessment. You can be there hours, either waiting for an ambulance, waiting for a member of their family to come and potentially take them to the hospital to sit with them. Because you can't section somebody inside their own home. It's something in law. So I could attend your house, Francis, and you could say, as soon as you leave, I'm gonna kill myself. The police are in a bit of a rock and a hard place then, because they can't leave, because if you leave, you're gonna hurt yourself. Mm-hmm. But if you say I'm not going to hospital, the police then either have to wait until an ambulance comes, or wait until an ambulance comes. They can't, and that can be hours. It's so, and when people are on a bridge, obviously the police need to speak, they're the ones who go and speak to them, they close the road and everything else to try and convince them to come on the other side. There's people who say that they've taken an overdose, police will get there first. If somebody has saying they're going to hurt themselves and they're out in the woods, the police go there, the police are going to try and find those people. Mental health is a massive, I don't want to say drain, it's not a drain, but it's a massive use of police time which is not being used on crime. So that was one of the big things I kind of discovered when I started in the police, of just how many mental health calls you go to. And I believe some forces had this, it was a right care, right resource, right care, right person initiative. And there was meant to be a paramedic or a mental health worker in the control room who, any mental health calls come in, they would go to them and they would direct medical professionals to them. From what I've been told and from what I saw, it did not reduce the amount of calls what went out, because the NHS is strapped for ambulances. They don't have as many ambulances as police cars. Also, it's a lot cheaper to get a couple of cops to drive to get there quicker. It's quicker, it's faster, it's cheaper. And then it's a case of, well, now that the police are there, the ambulance says, well, we've got this over here to deal with. And of course, when it comes to urgency, that person's still breathing, they're still talking, so it's not a case of the bleeding out and they need that urgent care immediately. And the police are there, but the police aren't mental health trained. The first aid trained, you might get a bit of an input when it comes to mental health in your initial training, but you're not mental health trained. So like I said, you're stuck with that person until you can they will either go to hospital or have someone to sit with them, or you can get an ambulance to them.
And look, and you've got to respond to what you respond to, but you've also under pressure to get arrests. So let's say you've taken an entire day supporting someone who wants to kill themselves. Then are you seen as being behind on your arrest quota?
So what might then happen is, if they say it gets to the end of the month and you need 4 arrests that month and you've only got 2, the justification for an arrest to happen might be a lot less.
Yeah.
In the sense, if you go to an incident, at one point you might have gone, I'm not locking up here, you know, I don't need to. Well, I am down on my arrest statistic, and my boss is going to I'm going to be put on an action plan, which means I'm potentially going to lose my job if I don't fulfill this action plan, if I'm not fulfilling the quotas. So then the justification is more reduced. And mate, the amount of officers I used to have come over to me or speak to me, who they just look like the world had ended, because they knew what they were doing was wrong and they didn't want to do it. And then the mental health implications that come with that, with the extra stress and everything else. The system is breaking cops, and it's an absolute, I believe, a national crisis what's happening. And it's a way to just completely demoralise your workforce, make them feel that they don't matter, and the concerns go ignored, their autonomy stripped away, and the workload as well. And I'm sorry, I know I'm going off topic here. The workloads as well, which officers have. How can one officer realistically, whilst dealing with response, whilst going to mental health calls, whilst needing to stop cars and pick up these quotas and everything else, fill these quotas, then realistically give a good quality service to their 30 victims, which they have in their workload, as well as the additional pressures what come from Crown Prosecution Service action plans, investigation plans you have to update, new templates which bosses bring in to fulfill this statistic, obscure statistic somewhere. How can one officer realistically do that? Plus then you work in shifts. So your mental health's not the best because you've just come off a string of nights. You're not eating properly. You're not seeing your family. You're missing Christmases, birthdays. To me, it's no wonder why cops break and why cops go off. And then often what happens is officers then get in shit for going off. This is what happened to me. So I went off for a couple of weeks with severe stress. I basically had a panic attack. I went into work one day, had a panic attack. I then came into work and my supervisor sat me down and then spent the next 20 minutes telling me why I was in the wrong for going off stressed. You mentioned gaslighting, pulling up all these different charts and graphs saying this is the best it's ever been. It's your fault why you're stressed. You know, we put in all these different places, all these different things. And it's like, all right.
And it's also as well because, and you capture it really well in your book, police work by its nature is deeply traumatic.
Yeah.
You talk about going to, you don't know what you're going to see. I remember you told one story about a guy who hung himself and your colleague was literally trying to support him as the man was in his death throes. I don't care who you are. That is going to have a very real, profound effect on your mental health.
So that was a good friend of mine who went to that, and this officer would be one of the first, kind of old school officer who'd be one of the first ones to go, oh, you just get on with it, you crack on. But the brain remembers that trauma. There's a great book called The Body Keeps Score, and it talks about this a lot. The brain remembers the trauma, the body remembers the trauma. Even if you don't acknowledge it or deal with it, that trauma's still there. And eventually this officer was single crewed, no chance of any backup, single crewed, went to this incident, and the guy was literally still alive, hanging by his neck. And he had to hold on to his legs. He was shouting for help on the radio. No one could come and support him because they were all single crewed, they were all dealing with incidents. And this guy literally died in this man's arms. So the officer then, a few weeks later, he was, he's fine, I'm okay. And then he was found in the fetal position, crying his eyes out on the floor. And he was then taken off front line and put into like a more desk-based role. This officer had 20 years experience, had dealt with all sorts. And it was just, that to anybody, to whether you're 10 years in, 5 years of that breaks so many people. And just the support isn't there for officers when that happens because of cuts and budget cuts and everything else, the first thing to go is, okay, well, we'll take the bit of officer welfare. So what's happening is officers are going to their supervisor and going, I'm really struggling here. I've been to X, Y, and Z. It's really playing on my mind. They're then being told, okay, well, we can get you a couple of weeks of therapy through the job. Might take a few weeks to get it, but you'll have that. And then if you're still not fixed, go speak to your own GP. Like, it can take 12 months to get a GP appointment, not a GP appointment, but get an NHS referral to counselling. Meanwhile, all that's happening is you're probably still on front line, so that accumulated trauma is still building. And officers, when they say that they're stressed and burnt out, and then being vindicated for being stressed and burnt out because they're then falling behind on the work. And even if you have a physical medical condition, I know someone who they couldn't go front line anymore because they had post-traumatic stress disorder and they had a heart condition. They were threatened with the job if they didn't get back on front line because they said, I can't go on front line because I'm currently going through therapy. I've been signed up by occupational health. Oh yeah, and I've got a bad heart. I can't do it. They were threatened with the job until the point they actually left. So the police might say that mental health support's there because they put on a mental health day, or they have an NCALP package, which is this online training package you do about mental health and about stress. So they can tick those boxes and say, yeah, we support our staff, but the actual real practical elements of it are quite lacking. I had a sergeant who was very, very good, who I did go to with an issue, saying we're going to hang him. Went to him, said, thinking about the hanging a lot I went to, you know, he was quite an awful one. And to be fair to him, he put his radio down and he went, right, back office. And we just sat and just like this for 10, 20 minutes. And that was all I needed. Just that person who was relatable, who were respected to sit there and go, it's okay, you know, all right. Don't go on the radio, you know, for the next 20 minutes, we're just going to have a chat. And then support was put in place afterwards. A lot of officers aren't getting that. And I think because a lot of officers are a lot of officers might be worried about opening up. Officers might be scared of being punished if they do open up, or they don't feel confident enough to open up. And they might not even recognise that the signs are there, that PTSD is there. So I was told by an officer recently that they were single crewed. They went to an incident of a male had severely harmed himself. And there was a member of the public there. This officer was on their own. Member of the public there trying to stem the bleeding. And they said that just training kicked in. I managed to stem the bleeding. About 10 minutes went by before anyone could come and get to me. Now, 10 minutes doesn't sound like a long time. If you're trying to stop some bleeding to death, 10 minutes is an eternity. And then I was off 4 or 5 hours late, went home, took my uniform off, and I was back in the next day, back on the front line. No kind of, hey, is everything okay? How was that incident last night? That would break so many people. And we just expect officers to be robots and it not to affect them. Because then when it does affect them, those officers are almost actively punished for being human.
And it's also as well, you go, there's the impact on the officers, but there's the impact on the public. If someone has got complex PTSD or they've had a profoundly stressful, traumatic incident, like what happened to a friend of yours, how are they going to be able to be effective in their jobs? They just can't. How are you going to be able to make effective decisions under pressure if you're struggling to cope?
Well, it's not really that. Some people might be more reactive, but then there's also the flip side of empathy burnout. So you deal with that many incidents, you deal with that many, no one ever rings the police when they're having a good day.
No.
So police officers every day are hearing the worst things, what have ever happened to somebody, day in, day out. To the person who have called the police, that's the first time they may have actually spoken about it. To that officer, it might be the 10th thing they've heard that day. And that burnout, that overexposure to trauma and nasty things and vicarious trauma then can have an effect on the officer of empathy burnout or compassion fatigue, where it's a case of they don't have any more empathy to give. It's not a case they don't care. It's a case of they can't get as invested as they would potentially like to, because it, like I say, it's the 10th thing they heard that day. And that's an issue, and that's caused by officers being overworked. It's caused by officers being burnt out. caused by officers having the days off cancelled, the time when they're supposed to be at home, resting, recuperating, looking after their mental health, spending time with the family, living a little bit outside of work, they then get cancelled. So officers are then back in.
Yeah, and you were there for 10 years. Because, you know, the things you're describing are obviously very difficult, but I imagine, you know, a lot of this would have been going on in the 80s and the 70s and so on. But in the 10 years that you were in the service, how did things evolve over that period of time? So
when I first started on response, it was a really good job. I loved it, really, really did. This whole stat hungry focus thing came in, I'd say about 3-4 years ago, when it really started. It was always kind of there, but you weren't necessarily graded on arrests. Even though I had quite high arrests, but it was never a case of I was made to do something. It was a case of I thought, well, this person needs to come in. Experience on the shift was much better. I walked in, I was, on my first day, the person closest to me, I think had 2 years in. The person next to them, it just went up at 5, 7, 11, 15, 20, 25 years. Now most officers have less, like I said before, like less than 5 years experience. And maybe there's one officer who's been on for 22 years because he can't afford to stop doing nights. Genuine person who I know. So you were given, so you had that camaraderie on the block because everyone had been on the same block for quite a long time, so everyone knew each other. You were given the ability to make your own decisions, and I think that was a huge part of it for me. Because I could go there and I could go, is this the right thing to do? If it is, I'll do it. If it's not, I'm not going to do it. And as long as you could justify it, your supervisor would have you back all day. Even if it wasn't necessarily a decision they agreed with, if you could justify that decision making with good rationale, they were more than happy to support you. Supervision was much more stable, whereas now an inspector spoke to me and said, on their shift alone, they're the 15th inspector in the past 6 months, and they've had 12, 13 different sergeants coming in and out. So that's a massive issue. Whereas when I started, it was okay, you had 3 sergeants. Those 3 sergeants were basically there for quite a number of years. So you had a really good working relationship. On training days, you would go and do, rather than do some video on this obscure piece of law, which you're never going to use, you would go out and you would go for food, or you would go do some training at the gym. And that was really good, but then that got stopped. And you had a lot more staff on the shift. People could talk a lot more openly about incidents, what bothered them. It was a really, really good unit to work on. And then this over time, as people left and new supervision came in and new superior leadership came in, it just showed this slow erosion. And then focus started coming in when maybe the chief constable changed. It just started to slowly break and break and break. And that's when we saw the amount of issues which I've been speaking about today.
Before Jay answers a final question, at the end of the interview, make sure to head over to our Substack. The link is in the description where you'll be able to see this.
Tired Moderate says, do you think there's a deliberate attempt to nudge normal people out of policing and replace them with ideologues?
Do the low salaries have anything to do with the number and quality of people wanting to go into policing?
Do you have any thoughts on the policing of protests, allegations of two-tier policing and all this other stuff?
I think two-tier policing is definitely a thing. 100%.
Really?
Yeah, 100%.
And the last question, as you know, we always ask is, what's the one thing we're not talking about that we should be?
So I thought about this, and okay, when it comes to a lot of the reasons why people offend, a lot of the time it's related to adverse childhood experiences, trauma, etc. I'm sure you know about this, teaching and everything else. People go on to offend because of issues what have happened. Maybe they then become drug addicts or alcoholics. They're trying to blank out this trauma. I've seen a lot of research when it comes to the effects what it can have on people in relation to anxiety, depression, and deep-rooted trauma with psychedelics, with magic mushrooms. So if you imagine that therapy is like slowly peeling back the layers of people to eventually slowly get to this thing which generally happened in childhood. Psychedelics, in particular magic mushrooms, is like a spearhead, something that goes straight into that part. I've had a lot of happened to me when I was younger, and a lot happened when I was in the job as well. I have done magic mushrooms since leaving the job, and I found I've had therapy. I've never went to medication, but I've had different forms of therapy as well. I found that the biggest impact to my life in relation to dealing with that sort of trauma was through this natural drug, which is obviously illegal. I would like to see a day where more research continues, and rather than people being traumatized, not knowing what to do, getting into situations where they find themselves in criminality and going through the system, if we can deal with the inner child, the traumatized person, the traumatized version of that person, with a very powerful thing such as psychedelics in a controlled way, I think that would reduce a lot of issues down this line, because we're dealing with it more this line. Because I know a few people on depression medication, etc. I know what happens as the dosage goes up. I feel that maybe we need to change the way we deal with trauma and look at something, like I said, which is illegal.
Thanks for coming on. Head on over to triggerpod.co.uk where Jay's going to answer your questions.
Is one of the reasons Britain's seen as a soft touch because we do not regularly arm our police, something that happens in many other countries?